Hello there, and welcome to today's edition of the Only Endometriosis podcast you need. Today I'm going to have a little bit of a rant. I'm going to call out a phrase that I hear all the time in my profession, and it's not just with other therapists. Personal trainers are guilty of this, hairdressers, beauticians even, and that's the phrase that self-care is non-negotiable. Now, I get the intention behind this phrase. I get the fact that it's designed to empower women, to support women to realise that looking after themselves should be a priority. I get the fact that we as women do need to take better care of ourselves in a lot of instances. We do need to shift aside this people-pleasing and this nurturing and caring for others and focus on ourselves. However, when we're saying things like self-care is non-negotiable, the empowerment that's meant behind it is or can be completely negated. It's a very, very masculine and patriarchal way of looking at self-care. Telling a woman that self-care is non-negotiable is a very kind of masculine vibe, masculine energy way of doing it. Most of the people I hear saying this are women, by the way. This is not a pop at men. Masculine vibe energy can come from males or females. It's all about the energy you're exuding, not necessarily your gender. But it's a very, very masculine vibe way of looking at self-care. And for many women, it creates the exact opposite. It has the opposite effect of that empowerment that I'm sure people who say this phrase mean. So if you're already struggling with to-do lists, if you're already struggling with recovery from trauma, if you're already struggling with low self-esteem, or you don't value yourself particularly highly, then that phrase of self-care being non-negotiable can drum up all sorts of feelings of guilt. It can add to the overwhelm, it can add to stress and anxiety. So the first thing to say here is to please know that if you hear that phrase, and I'm not going to say it again, but if you hear that phrase and it kind of sends all the wrong feels, if you get that guilt, that overwhelm, that stress, then please know that this is really, really common. And actually self-care is negotiable. Self-care is a really, really gentle, beautiful act. And there's different ways of doing self-care. In today's episode, I'm going to look at if this phrase that I won't say again, but if this phrase that I won't say again does strike terror into you, then please know that there are different ways of framing self-care that make it way more accessible and way more easy to achieve. What we don't want to do is make self-care feel like it is another obligation. We don't want it to feel like it's a chore, like a task. And I'm going to kind of contradict myself as I go through this podcast because I've had to negotiate this really negative reaction to that kind of approach, to that kind of masculine, you must do this, you must do that. And I do actually add self-care onto my to-do lists, but not in a kind of a negative kind of chastise myself if I don't do it kind of way. So please know that if this is you, if this is resonating with you, there are things you can do, and I will talk through it in this podcast. What we want to do is view self-care as something that isn't going to push it further down the priority list. If you feel as if you have to do it, if somebody's telling you you have to do it, if you get those sense of overwhelm, of guilt, of shame, of anxiety, of like you're letting yourself down or letting other people down, if you don't do it, then this podcast is for you. So I just want to talk a little bit about why that phrase, that I won't repeat, feels like or can feel like it's adding stress and pressure. When I do know, and I'm not calling out individuals, I get the fact that it's meant to be empowering. And I've worked with so many other professionals who have never experienced trauma, they've never experienced anxiety. And for them, it's an alien concept. They are able to say it is, I'm going to say the phrase, it is non-negotiable for them because they don't have that trauma response. They don't have that anxiety response to being told that it's non-negotiable. But what can happen if you are one of these people like myself who are overcoming trauma, who have anxiety, who are people pleasers, who are very sensitive, it can feel like another demand. So it can feel like it's somebody else adding pressure to do something. And it's not even that you don't necessarily want to do it. Of course, we all want to feel good. We all want to take care of ourselves. It's not that we don't want to do it. It's that it can just feel overwhelming. If somebody's telling you, you must do this, when you feel as if you must do a whole host of other things, it's not easy to prioritise anything in that list. All of the things on that list just become one big overwhelm, and that includes the self-care. As women, especially women who are balancing different priorities and who are struggling with their symptoms, already feel that weight. They already feel the responsibilities, and adding this self-care responsibility to that list is actually counterintuitive and counterproductive. It can feel like if you don't manage to do your self-care thing, so if you don't manage to do your 20-minute yoga stretches or your even your food diary, if you don't manage to do those kind of things, it can feel like you're failing. It can feel like it's another thing on the to-do list that you just didn't manage to get done today. Excuse me. It also implies that it kind of strives for perfection. So it implies that there's a right and wrong way to do self-care. It has the connotation that self-care, in order to do self-care, you have to do something. So you have to do a meditation, you have to do a spa day, you have to do a juice for breakfast, you have to do all of these things. It actually implies that in order to do self-care, it's an activity. When actually, if you are short of time, if you're short of money, if you're short of energy, if your pain levels are peaking for whatever reason, and you don't have to justify it to yourself or anyone, but if for whatever reason you can't do something that day, it implies that you're not looking after yourself. When actually sometimes doing absolutely nothing, saying to yourself, I can't do my self-care today, is actually a very powerful act of self-care in itself. So don't buy into this concept of self-care means having to do something. It can actually be doing absolutely nothing, and that is absolutely fine. If you feel as if you're doing self-care wrong, then that can be more detrimental than not doing any self-care at all. So some days self-care is literally hiding back under the duvet. Now, people may argue that that's not self-care, that you need to be doing something actively to make yourself feel good. I would argue that that's adding to overwhelm, that's adding to this idea of perfection, of this Instagram-ready self-care yoga stretches and on the side of a cliff at sunrise kind of bollocks, excuse my language. But it isn't. That isn't what self-care is about. And adding that pressure to yourself to have this perfect Instagram-ready version of self-care is actually really, really damaging. And it can also lead to, like I say, it can lead to guilt. It can lead to overwhelm. It can lead to stress. But it can also amplify any feelings you've already got of sort of negative self-image, of inadequacy. Because if you feel you should be doing all of these fabulous Instagram-worthy self-care routines and you're not managing to do them, again, like I say, it can add to that feeling of failure. You can feel as if you failed in self-care, which we think should be something that we're all doing. It's non-negotiable. But if you're failing at it, it can just make you feel even more inadequate than you potentially did already. And the downside of that is that it becomes a stick rather than a carrot. So it's almost like you are, or not necessarily you, but the people who are using this phrase, intentionally or unintentionally, are using kind of this shame, this guilt to motivate you. And that rarely leads to lasting change. Because the first day you may get into this self-care ritual for 3 days, 5 days, a week, 2 weeks. But if you're using this methodology, if you're using this, it's non-negotiable, I must do this. I said I wouldn't use that phrase again, didn't I? But I must do this, I must do that. And you may well do it, but then as soon as you fail, as soon as you don't do it for 1 day, that's a failure. And if you're a sensitive person, like I say, if you're already struggling with self-doubt, then that can lead you to just completely withdraw from the routines, from the rituals, from the self-care. It doesn't acknowledge, so this kind of the masculine energy of that phrase doesn't acknowledge that a lot of us have, well, we have time barriers, we have kind of logistical barriers to doing self-care, but we also have emotional barriers as well. You've heard me talk before about how the brain reacts to change, even positive change. We are safe, we are secure where we are. So if we're talking about big changes, if you're talking about, I want to lose 2 stone, or I want to do X, Y, and Z, they are changes. And yes, okay, the outcome may be positive, but our brain doesn't respond in that way. And that messaging, that harsh masculine energy messaging around self-care, leaves no room for a more gentle approach. It leaves no room for that kind of that failure, in inverted commas. Most of us don't neglect self-care because we want to. Most women aren't neglecting self-care because we want to put on weight, because we want to have more pain. Speaking from personal experience, because we want to have roots longer than our actual die. It's just because, well, it can be for many reasons. We can feel exhausted. Our energy levels are so depleted. We have so much else that we think we should be prioritising. We can feel unsupported. So many women I work with feel they have a support network, but they don't necessarily feel as if that support network is giving them the support they need. And again, that's very, very common. And I might do a podcast on this in the future. It's really, really common. And when you feel unsupported, or when your needs aren't being met through nobody's fault, it's not necessarily that you're being actively unsupported, but just that your needs aren't necessarily being met. It can be it can be incredibly difficult to stand up and put your own needs first, especially if that's coupled with ingrained conditioning, which many of us have, that tell us that our needs come last. If you're used to people pleasing, if you're used to putting other people's needs first, then if you couple all of these together, well, that in itself is quite damaging, but if you're coupling all of these things together, then it can feel as if doing self-care is just a huge, huge step too far. The emotional barriers, the logistical barriers of actually doing self-care are just too much. And again, the feelings that come with that, the feelings of feeling as if you're putting somebody else's needs aside to look after yourself, can be really, really guilt-inducing for many, many women. Like I say, it ingrains this sense of self-care being an activity, something to perfect, something to work at. And if you can't do that, then you may as well not bother. Self-care is non-negotiable. So if it's negotiable, if you kind of say, do you know what, I'm supposed to go for a run today, but I'm really not feeling it, then you feel as if you failed, you retreat, and you just think, well, do you know what, I might as well not bother. I'm not going to be able to sustain this. I may as well just not bother. That all or nothing mindset. Well, if I can't do it today, I'm not going to do it at all. I might commit to try something else, and that will work for a couple of weeks, and then I might fail. I might miss one day, and then just think, do you know what, I can't do this either. And that sense of shame, of negativity around yourself just keeps building and building, and it just gets more and more difficult to even contemplate, in inverted commas, self-care. So you just decide to not do any self-care at all. You don't want to do anything. It's so common. And it's all based around, or not all of it's based around this phrase, but this phrase is really, really not helpful if you're struggling with all of these things. So if this phrase does make you feel worse, if, like me, the idea of anything being non-negotiable just strikes fear, terror and anxiety into you, then just have a gentle think about what self-care means to you. Just completely wipe the slate clean. Don't think about it as something you have to do. Think about it more in terms of the feeling that you want to achieve. How do you want to feel? And redefine self-care to fit into that feeling. So self-care does not have to be doing anything. It doesn't have to be time consuming. It doesn't have to be expensive. It can be something as simple as having a glass of water on a morning. It can be something, and again, I talk a lot about rituals. I don't necessarily like the word routine. You've heard me talking about this before. The idea of routine, this is personal to me. I'd get that not everybody views it the same, but the idea of routine to me suggests that it's something that you should be doing every morning. A ritual to me is something that is more pick up and drop off, or switch it around a little bit. It's a bit less rigid, and it's something that you can do whenever you feel like it. So I have rituals that I do. I could have a bedtime ritual. To me, that's not the same as a bedtime routine, because if I don't do it, I just pick it up when I need to do it. A bedtime routine feels like you have to do it every day. A ritual that I do at bedtime is something that I pick up if I need to. And that's why I talk a lot about having these rituals as toolkits, as self-care toolkits for yourself. So a morning ritual could be to have a glass of water. It could be to have a glass of water with a slice of lemon in it to get all your systems kick-started in the morning. Now, a routine would be to get up and have this glass of water and have this slice of lemon, and you have that first thing on the morning. A ritual could be that you get up, you do a few things, you potter around, you maybe go for a run, you maybe go for a walk if you're feeling like that. You maybe don't, you maybe get dressed, you maybe don't. And at some point you think, do you know what, I quite fancy that glass of water. And that's when the ritual kicks in. So reframe things so that it's completely on your terms. You also want to be able to say no to something. And saying no to yourself is so empowering. It's so empowering as long as you're doing it for the right reasons. If you can redetermine self-care, like I say, it could be that, I'm doing a couch to 5K, and I know I'm supposed to do a run on my run schedule, on my run routine. It says that I have to do interval training today, but you know what? My energy levels are just so depleted that I'm not going to do it today. My self-care to myself today is to say, I'm not going to do it. Oh, and by the way as well, I've given a reason there saying my energy levels are depleted. Sometimes we just don't feel like it, and we don't have to justify our decision to say no. We don't have to justify why we don't want to do something. Just not wanting to do it is reason enough. Years ago, I used to do scuba diving, and one of my trainers said to me, he won't be listening, but Billy T, if you are listening, thank you for this advice. I use it in many areas of my life. And he said to me, if for whatever reason you don't want to do a dive, don't do it, because that gut feeling is telling you that something's wrong, that something isn't right with this dive. And if you're feeling that, even in a slightest way, you say no to the dive. It doesn't matter if you're letting your buddy down. It doesn't matter if you could even get to the edge of the boat and be about to jump in. And if you get that feeling that something's wrong, just don't do it. And that's the gut feeling that I talk about so often. And I talked about it before this dive instruction. But it's so important, and it's the same with everything else. If you're getting a feeling that you don't want to do something, then listen to that gut feeling. Now, I'm not saying that that's reason enough not to do it whenever, because if you struggle with anxiety, if you do struggle with trauma response, then we do get that reaction quite often. But to gently challenge it, can you reframe it? Can you reassure yourself that everything's fine? Now, when I say reassure yourself, I don't mean convince yourself. I just mean just gently question your belief. Why don't you want to do it? If you're feeling, okay, I should go for a run today, but you know what? I'm just not feeling it. Fine, but gently challenge that. Gently challenge is it a gentle anxiety prompt that something may happen? Can I reframe it to make myself want to do it? And again, this isn't about should. This isn't about being non-negotiable. This is just about gently challenging, gently connecting with yourself, with your innerness, just to see whether it genuinely is something that just isn't right for you that day, or whether it's something that you can gently reframe and then you feel completely different about it. Whichever outcome, whether it is something you definitely don't want to do or whether it's something that you can reframe, whichever outcome is absolutely fine. Excuse me. Take a deep breath. that's normally quite a really good way of doing it. Take a deep breath, and as you're breathing out, just really tune into your thoughts and your feelings. And if you still don't want to do it at the end of the deep breath, then that's kind of your intuition telling you something. What you can do as well is a really, really nice way of doing it. So if it's a big thing that you had planned to do that day, take the Zen approach. It's something that I talk about a lot in my life, taking the Zen approach, the path of least resistance. Let it play out itself. So instead of saying, oh, okay, well, if I'm going to go for a run, I don't know if you drive to where you're running or if you run from home, but it could be, then you have to have a shower afterwards. It could be an hour and a half, 2 hours out of your day. If you're struggling with time, if you're struggling with that feeling of overwhelm, then that can be, now I'm going to say it can be too much. Actually, it can be exactly what you need. Some days you can take 2 hours out, even though you've got a to-do list as long as your arm, and actually taking 2 hours out for yourself is absolutely the best thing to do, even if it doesn't feel like it at the time. Sometimes that is the best thing to do. Other times it's not, because it's just going to make you feel even worse. So on those days, you either say, do you know what, I'm just going to get through my to-do list. That's my act of self-care today. Or you build something else into your day. So you say, do you know what, I'm not going to go for a run today because I don't have time, and that's absolutely fine. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to have a mindful cup of tea. I'm going to get outside just for 30 minutes. I'm going to do some stretches. I'm going to do some qigong stretches. I'm going to put my favourite music on while I'm getting dressed. Do something else that raises your vibrations, that lifts your spirits, that makes you feel good. Because sometimes, quite often, saying no to the self-care that you had planned, if you've got in this mindset that it's non-negotiable and you should be doing it in X, Y, and Z, and it's all very masculine and very shame-driven, then you will feel that shame or that guilt or that overwhelm. So just shift that feeling. So do something that's going to lift your vibrations, that are going to make you feel happy again. And release this idea of perfect self-care. There's no ideal version of what self-care is. So even if you have to unfollow loads of beautiful young yoga instructors on beaches, that's absolutely fine. Do whatever you need to do to release this perfect version of self-care. What works for you, what makes you feel happy, because essentially that's all self-care is. What we want to do is to feel happy. Self-care is about being happy. So just do something, do one thing every day that's going to lift your spirits, that brings a bit of joy into your life. And it's surprising how much easier self-care, in inverted commas, feels when you're feeling happier, when you're feeling a little bit of joy in your life. And that's the other thing as well. Recognise where you are in your cycle, recognise where you are in your life. In the summer, things feel completely different for a lot of us. A lot of us are impacted by the changing of the seasons, and that's fine, that's normal, that's natural. We are, as humans, designed to perform better when the sun's out. That's how our primeval brains exist. So what works for you in the summer might not work for you in the winter. What works for you in the morning might not work for you in the afternoon. Just lean into all of those natural variations. Chuck out the rule book that says this will make you feel better. Just lean into what you need and what makes you feel better. Like I say, recognising that self-care isn't all about doing. Sometimes it's about resting. Sometimes it's about not doing. Sometimes it's just about having that off day without guilt, without feeling bad, without feeling as if you've let yourself down, without feeling like you've let anyone else down. And be gentle with yourself. I say this so often, and actually I say it like it's just a flippant thing, but actually it can be quite difficult to do. If you struggle to prioritise yourself, then there could be, and probably is, a deep reason for that. So instead of pushing yourself harder, instead of feeling like you should be doing it, instead of writing it as a non-negotiable in your to-do list, just be really, really gentle with yourself. Approach it with compassion. If you were a friend, if you were a child, if you were your child, if you were your animal, your pet, how would you approach it with them? You'd have so much more compassion. then often we show ourselves, and curiosity as well, try and figure out why you're feeling this barrier to doing the thing that you said you were going to do, and actually what would nurture you instead, what would make you feel truly happy right in that moment. It might be that thing, it might be that you can reframe it and do the thing that you were going to do, but it may well be that just at that moment you fundamentally need something else. And I'm just going to talk a little bit now as well about, I mentioned it earlier, that kind of trauma response. If you are struggling with trauma, if you do get guilt or shame, if you do sort of turn to avoidance rather than looking at it, I just want to give you a little bit of an explanation as to why that might be, because when I realised this in my own life, it made such a difference to my own self-care rituals, my own approach to self-care. If you grow up in an environment where your needs are dismissed, and that's not necessarily an abusive childhood, that's not necessarily a neglectful childhood, but for a lot of us, especially as women, we did grow up in environments where our needs were dismissed, where we were never asked what we need, whether we were never supported to understand exactly what it is that we needed. So even asking yourself, what do I need right now, will not come naturally. And it may even trigger anxiety. So the point that I just made about sort of tuning into your vibes, tuning into what you want right in the moment, if that causes anxiety, please just know that this is a natural response. If you're not used to being asked, either by yourself or by others, what you need and what you want, what's going to make you feel good, then as you start to ask yourself that, as you start to prioritise your needs or even identify your needs, it actually may trigger a bit of anxiety. So if that does happen, just know that that is a perfectly natural, perfectly valid response to that question. If you've just been in survival mode, if you've literally not been thinking about yourself, if you've just been getting through the day, then setting that priority for yourself, slowing down, tuning into what you need can feel really, really unfamiliar. And it can actually be almost like a threat as well. So if you feel that, just know that this is a natural response and a valid response. When you get past this, when you gently work through it, then self-care becomes restorative. It becomes something that's good for you. But if you're not at that phase, then starting self-care can actually, like I say, it can be threatening. It can be anxiety-inducing. We talk about fight or flight, but what we don't really talk about is flop as well. So there's freeze, flop, whatever you want to call it. That is a nervous system response. So if you are recovering from trauma, if you are in this situation where your needs haven't been met, and to think about yourself is traumatic, your nervous system might actually respond with fight, flight, or flop, fight, flight, or freeze. And if it's feeling overwhelming, if you get this response, your brain may just shut down completely. So I talked before about how we see, or we feel in a lot of instances, like we just think, do you know what, I'm just not going to bother, it's all or nothing. The brain freezes, the brain flops. It just says, do you know what, I can't even go there at the moment. And I hear so many, and I've said it myself, but I hear so many people say this, do you know what, I've got so much on, I can't even go there at the minute. When your brain flops like that, it can make it harder to take any action, no matter how small. So if you are feeling like that, if you are in that space, then telling something that self-care is non-negotiable, or anything's non-negotiable, that paralysis just gets worse. Rather than helping you move forward, rather than helping the person move forward, what it actually does is cement them in place, and even worse, it can actually make them go backwards as well, because then if you start adding shame, the guilt, the feeling that you've let people down, it can actually send you into retrograde kind of thing. Talked a little bit about self-worth as well. Quite often, a lot of women, if you've experienced trauma, if you've been living in fight or flight for a long time, if you've been living in survival mode, it can actually make it hard for you to believe in yourself that you deserve this. that you deserve rest, that you deserve joy, that you deserve pleasure or nourishment or self-care or all of those things. If you struggle with self-worth and actually getting to that point where you believe you are worthy of even 10 minutes of meditative time, can be really, really difficult. And actually hearing that phrase as it's worded so often can actually feel like you're being told off. It can actually feel like it's a bit of a rebuke rather than a sign of encouragement. So again, if that's you, just know that that's not the intention behind the phrase. The phrase is meant by everybody who says it with the best of intentions. So if you hear it and you have that kind of reaction that you feel as if you're being told off, if you can, just reframe it. Just tell yourself that isn't the intention behind the words. The intention behind the words is way more gentle than the words themselves suggest. It is that you are worthy of self-care. You are worthy of healing. You are worthy of whatever it is you want the outcome to be. You are worthy of it. So I don't want you to feel like it's a trap. I don't want you to feel like it's an impossible standard that you're never going to meet. Quite often, if we have struggled with loss, if we've struggled with toxic relationships, violent, abusive relationships, romantic or otherwise, friendships, family relationships, we can feel as if we have been held to impossible standards for so long. Self-care is not supposed to be one of those. Self-care is something really, really gentle, very, very personal, something that nourishes you because you are worth it. But if you spent a lot of time living up to those impossible standards, setting that non-negotiable standard of anything can be detrimental. If you're told you should prioritise yourself, you should prioritise your self-care, then you can get these feelings of shutdown rather than empowerment. It can actually feel as well, and I recognise myself in this, if I'm told to do something, then I do rebel against it. And that is as a result of years of having to live with meeting standards, meeting other people's expectations. So if I'm told by somebody, especially if it's somebody who, for whatever reason, reminds me of the people who've been holding me to these standards all these years, well, actually that's unfair. I've kind of held myself to these standards, but as a result of, anyway, you get where I'm coming from. But if it's kind of somebody who reminds me or something has pushed me back, then that's even stronger, this feeling of rebellion. Well, do you know what? Sod you. I'm not going to do my self-care today because who are you to tell me what to do? Again, very, very valid response. If we reframe self-care as to something that's purely for you, you are worthy of it, you deserve it, you deserve to be happy, and self-care is just a route to happiness. Excuse me. Quite often, and I had counselling, I've had counselling on and off for many years, but I remember one of my counsellors, I used to use tarot cards all the time. There was a point in my life where I did tarot readings my Sunday evening ritual, and I would actually go as far to say it probably was a routine at that point, but my Sunday evening ritual was to draw 7 tarot cards, and that would be my plan for the week. If I had a big decision to make, I would draw a tarot card. And I would turn to tarot cards more often probably than I care to admit to myself. And I remember my counsellor saying, "Why are you doing this?" And I was very like, "Oh, well, it's mystical. I love it. It gives me so much knowledge. It gives me so much comfort." And of course it did. And it still does. I still do pull tarot cards. I pull tarot cards for myself. I do readings for other people every now and again. And it is something that something that I like to do. It's something that's very powerful for me. My counsellor made me see that actually all I was doing, I was living by myself. I'd left an abusive relationship. I'd had years of living to other people's standards and of living my life guided by other people's principles. And all I was doing was substituting those other people's voices for the tarot cards. I was still at the point where I was unable to trust myself, to listen to myself. I didn't have the trust in my own emotions, decision-making, whatever it was, to listen to myself. So I'd use the tarot cards to tell me what to do. essentially I was still telling myself, you always have the actions, your higher being, your higher knowledge always knows. But I didn't have the confidence in my ability to trust myself, I suppose. So I was using the tarot cards as a crutch. That is so common. And true healing comes when we learn to listen to ourselves, when we learn to trust ourselves. So even just 5 minutes of really tuning into what you do want and what you do desire, even if that's anxiety inducing in the early stages, is hugely healing. It's hugely empowering, but it's hugely healing. And healing requires gentleness, not pressure. Especially if you're healing from trauma, even if it's just sort of small amounts of trauma. If you're healing from trauma, your recovery isn't linear. And neither is self-care. Some weeks you might absolutely boss the self-care. You might be out going to the gym at 3:30 in the morning. You might be following that up with an ice cold shower or an ice bath and all of these things that you see on Instagram that are supposed to be really good for you. And then 2 weeks' time, you can barely get dressed by lunchtime and you're wallowing around in yesterday's socks. Self-care isn't linear. The important thing is to tune into yourself and just ask yourself, is it bringing you joy? Is it making you happy? What feels happiness? What feels happiness? What feels as if it's bringing you happiness one day? What feels helpful one day might be impossible the next, and that is absolutely fine. Do you know that most women I work with, this is a bit of an aside, but most women I work with take weeks or months to actually sign up to me. And that's because I work predominantly with women who have complex needs, I suppose, is the right way of saying it. It's probably not the right way of saying it. And I do put myself in that category as well, by the way, because I work with women who are very much like me, who've been through what I've been through. And it's not deliberate. It's just how it is. But most women take a long time before they sign up to me. And it isn't just a case of seeing a couple of social media posts or listening to a couple of podcasts and you sign up. It's literally, some women can take months before thinking, or between thinking, do you know what? That's making a lot of sense. This is resonating, to actually booking in. And that's not even necessarily the long-term commitment programs. This is even just for one standalone session. And that's absolutely fine. It's because that sense of change, the fear of change, the prioritization of yourself, but also that feeling as if somebody else is controlling you, that feeling as if somebody else is telling you should be doing this. And I realise that I do that all the time on these podcasts. These podcasts are designed to empower women. These podcasts are designed to put information and knowledge out there from my brain. They're not designed to say you should be doing this, you should be doing that. But I am very aware that the result of some of these podcasts is me saying you should do this and you shouldn't do that, even if I'm not explicitly saying that, although I do say that sometimes, quite a lot. But yeah, this is not a linear journey. It's not an easy journey. And if you are feeling like you know what you want, but you don't know how to get there, that is again very, very overwhelming. And it can take time. It does take time, and a gentle approach. A rigid, non-negotiable approach doesn't leave any room for these natural ebbs and flows, for these natural energy flows, for the natural, the dips that we have in our own confidence, everything that we're going on. We are such complex beings, and this rigid approach doesn't leave any wriggle room for that. So instead of dictating what self-care should look like, just take a gentle approach. Just tune in to what feels possible for you that day, what feels possible that moment, and do write it in a to-do list if you want to. But that to-do list is not a to-do list. It's just a list of things you'd like to get done, and it doesn't matter if you don't do them. I had a boss once who said to me, what's the worst thing that's going to happen? What's the worst thing that's going to happen if you don't do that today? There are very, 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 very few things that if you don't get done today, the result will be actually catastrophic. Quite often something may happen that requires somebody else to step in. That's absolutely fine. That's absolutely fine. So release this idea of perfect self-care. Recognise that self-care isn't always about doing. Sometimes it's about doing absolutely nothing. And be very, very gentle with yourself. Because when you're being gentle with yourself, when you're tuning into exactly what it is that you need, then that can be a traumatic event in itself. That can be a triggering response. So just know if that is a trigger for you, that is valid and not uncommon. And if you're stuck in that hesitation phase, and when I talked about people booking in with me and taking months, it's not just that kind of step towards healing, but also it's exactly the same with gym membership. Again, I've done it myself. I've ummed and ahed for months about joining a gym. Then I've joined a gym and I'm paying the membership and I still haven't gone. That's that kind of that almost phase. So know that that's completely normal. Hesitation is completely normal. Being unsure about something, it doesn't mean you're not ready. It just means you care about the decision. It means that people used to say to me I was an overthinker. I'm not necessarily certain we can label it as overthinking. It's just that you're very, very cautious of, it's almost like I suppose it's the anxiety response. It's the trigger response. You're cautious and mindful of what the outcome can be, and you're not necessarily 100% ready, or you feel that you're not as 100% ready for the outcome. So don't think about the outcome as if it's going to happen tomorrow. Just take things gently, one step at a time. If you're overwhelmed, talk to somebody. If it's about a gym membership, it's about working with somebody like me. If it's about learning qigong, if it's anything like that, talk to somebody. Reach out and talk to somebody about it. If you don't want to talk to a human, then journal. Put it all down in a journal. It's amazing how much better you feel when it's all out there. And trust that the timing's right as well. If you're not feeling like you want to sign up to a new intake at the gym, then that's fine. It might not be just the right time for you. You will trust when the timing's right. If it's something that you keep going back to, if you keep looking at the CrossFit class in the local gym and you think, do you know what, I might do. Even if it's in a few months' time, even if it's next year, the year after, when the timing's right, it will be right to take that next step. So, much longer podcast than I'd intended this morning. Thank you for sticking with it if you stuck with it all of this time. Just as a final thought, self-care doesn't have to be perfect. You don't have to feel ready. It doesn't have to be doing anything. Doing nothing is perfectly valid. Just be really, really gentle with yourself. Nothing happens all at once. Healing especially happens in its own way, in its own time. If you need reassurance or a chat or just permission to take things at your own space, then reach out either to me or somebody like me, or to your journal if you don't want to talk to anybody in person or like an actual human about it. You've totally got this. Self-care is all about bringing an element of joy into every single day. So even if that is looking at a picture of your dog, even if that is listening to your favourite music, that is perfect, legitimate self-care. Until next time, do take good care, and I shall speak to you soon.